Have you ever sat in a courtroom and watched someone you once called family lie so smoothly it almost sounded rehearsed? Not stumble. Not hesitate. Just look a judge in the eye and lie with the confidence of someone who thinks they've already won. I have. I sat in that courtroom in Austin, Texas, with my hands folded in my lap and counted the ceiling tiles above the jury box. 12. I counted them 3 times just to keep my face still while my sister-in-law, Renee, stood at the podium describing me as unstable, overly emotional, and unfit to question the handling of my own mother's estate. And behind her, sitting in quiet support, were people who had eaten at my mother's table for years, nodding. My name does not matter. What matters is that my mother, Carol, spent 31 years building a life carefully, patiently, exactly the way some people assemble fragile glass. And when she died, someone was already waiting with a pen. My mother raised my brother Marcus and me in a 2-bedroom house in Cedar Park, just outside Austin. She worked as a paralegal for 22 years. She was the kind of woman who kept paper copies of everything, laminated her insurance cards, and once drove 40 minutes back to a restaurant because she thought she might have left a receipt on the table. She was meticulous in a way that made other people laugh until they needed her to find something no one else could find. Marcus is 6 years older than I am. He was always the one who got called first, the one who drove her to appointments when I was still finishing school. I never resented that. What I didn't understand until much later was what happened in those quiet hours. I wasn't there. And more specifically, what happened after Renee entered the picture. Renee was charming in the polished, attentive way certain people are when they want access. She remembered birthdays. She brought herbal tea. She started calling my mother Mom before Marcus had even proposed. And my mother, who had been lonelier than she ever admitted out loud, opened the door. I noticed things, small things, at first. The way Renee steered casual conversations toward money. The way she showed up at my mother's house on weekday afternoons when I was at work. The way my mother once began telling me something over the phone, then stopped mid-sentence and said, "Never mind, it's nothing." I filed those moments away. I didn't know yet what they meant. 2 years before my mother died, she was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. She told me herself, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold between her hands. She was calm. Calm enough to frighten me. She told me she had already spoken to her attorney and updated her will. She said everything was taken care of. I asked if I could see the documents, and she said yes. Then Renee came in through the back door carrying groceries, and the conversation ended. I didn't push. I told myself I was respecting my mother's independence. What I was really doing was underestimating how quickly proximity can turn into influence. My mother died 14 months later. She was 63. The disease moved faster than anyone expected, and in those final months she drifted in and out of clarity in a way that still hurts to remember. It felt like losing her in pieces before we lost her completely. 2 weeks after the funeral, Marcus called and said we needed to talk about the estate. I drove to his house expecting paperwork, signatures, a difficult but straightforward conversation. Instead, Renee handed me a single sheet of paper across the kitchen counter like she was passing me a menu. It wasn't the will, it was a typed summary. Plain paper, no letterhead, no signatures. According to that summary, my mother had revised her will 8 months before she died. The house, the savings, the investment account she had built over 20 years, all of it had been transferred to Marcus as sole beneficiary. I was listed for personal items and a symbolic amount. I asked to see the actual will. Marcus said his attorney had it. I asked for the attorney's name. Renee said they'd send it to me. I drove home and sat in my car in my own driveway for nearly an hour. I'm a forensic accountant. I've spent 7 years reconstructing financial records for litigation. I know what last-minute revisions look like. I know what coercion can look like when it comes dressed as caregiving. I know what pressure on a signature looks like. And I knew this much: my mother was careful with everything. Careful women do not suddenly rewrite their entire estate without explanation, while their health is declining and their daughter-in-law is suddenly always in the room. I didn't call Marcus back. I called my attorney. Her name is Patricia, and she has the kind of stillness that makes dishonest people talk too much. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me one question. "Do you have documents in your mother's handwriting from before the diagnosis?" I did. Birthday cards. A handwritten recipe she mailed me on an index card. A 2-page letter she wrote when I graduated college, folded into an envelope that still smelled faintly like her kitchen. Patricia told me not to contact Marcus or Renee again about the will. She told me to gather everything and let her work. So I did. For 4 months, I said almost nothing. While Marcus posted renovation photos from my mother's house on social media, new counters, A painted bedroom, the sewing room emptied out and turned into something sleek and unrecognizable. I stayed quiet. But Patricia did not. She pulled the filed will through probate court. Public record. Something Renee apparently had not considered. The revised will was exactly what the summary claimed. Executed 8 months before my mother's death. Signed, witnessed, notarized. On paper, it looked clean. Too clean. I reached out to my mother's original estate attorney, Gerald, who had drafted her previous will 11 years earlier. He was retired, but he remembered her immediately. He told me she had contacted his office about 10 months before her death and had seemed, in his words, entirely herself. Since he was no longer taking new estate work, he had referred her to a colleague. That colleague's name was not on any document Marcus or Renee had shown me. The notary on the revised will was a woman named Shelley. Patricia found her through the state notary database and sent a formal inquiry. Once discovery opened, we got the log. Shelley worked out of a UPS store in Round Rock. Her notary book showed she had notarized the will on a Thursday afternoon. My mother's medical records told a different story. That same Thursday afternoon, my mother had a scheduled physical therapy appointment 12 miles away in the opposite direction. She attended it. The session lasted 90 minutes. There was a sign-in sheet. There were treatment notes. There was my mother's signature on the clinic paperwork. She could not have been in both places. When Patricia called me with that, I did not feel victorious. I felt cold, because by then it was no longer a suspicion. It was proof that someone had planned this, chosen a date, chosen a location, built a timeline around a sick woman's illness, and assumed no one would ever check. Patricia filed the will contest in Travis County Probate Court. Marcus hired an attorney immediately. Renee hired her own attorney separately, which told me more than either of them ever could. People in a united marriage do not usually start building separate exits unless blame is already being discussed behind closed doors. The weeks before the hearing were quiet on the surface and vicious underneath. Renee called once and left a voicemail saying she hoped we could resolve this like family. She said our mother would have wanted peace. I saved the voicemail and sent it to Patricia. Marcus texted me that grief was making me paranoid. He said he was worried about me. He said Renee had only ever tried to help. I read that message twice and forwarded it to Patricia too. The morning of the hearing, I woke up at 5:30, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table looking at a photograph of my mother from 4 years earlier. It was taken at a restaurant downtown on her birthday. She was laughing at something outside the frame, fully herself, untouched by any of what came later. I looked at that picture and said out loud, "I've got it, Mom. I've got all of it." Then I put on my blazer and drove to the courthouse. The room was smaller than I expected. Marcus sat at one table in a dark suit. Renee sat beside him in a navy dress I recognized as new. She looked composed in the way people do when they think presentation can substitute for truth. The judge was Sandra Okafor, late 50s, reading glasses on a chain, the kind of face that told you immediately she did not care how beautifully anyone lied. Marcus's attorney, Douglas, opened by calling the will valid, the challenge emotional, and my objections the result of disappointment rather than evidence. He used the word clarity so many times it began sounding like a threat. Then Patricia stood. She did not perform, she built. The notary log, the physical therapy appointment records, the sign-in sheet, the mileage between locations. A statement from the physical therapist who remembered my mother from that exact Thursday because they had talked about a television show they both watched. One document at a time, Patricia laid them in front of the judge. The room changed. Douglas objected. Judge Okafor overruled him. He objected again, overruled. By the third objection, even he sounded less certain. Then Patricia entered the handwriting analysis. A certified forensic document examiner had compared the signature on the revised will to verified samples from my mother across decades. According to the report, the signature on the will was inconsistent in 14 measurable ways. Pressure distribution wrong, letter spacing wrong, stroke formation wrong. And most damning of all, the long curling tail my mother always put on her lowercase y, a tiny, habitual mark so consistent the examiner described it as a signature fingerprint was missing. Judge Okafor took off her glasses and looked at the report for a long time. Then she looked up. Not at Marcus, not at Douglas. At Renee. "Ma'am," she said, "I have some questions for you." What followed was not dramatic in the way movies teach you to expect. It was slower than that, more precise, more brutal. Because truth, when it finally gets the room it deserves, does not need theatrics. Renee's voice changed almost immediately. The polish slipped first, then the certainty. She said she hadn't known there was any discrepancy with the notary. She said she assumed the attorney had handled everything. She said she was only trying to carry out what my mother wanted. Judge Okafor asked, "What exactly did your mother-in-law want?" Renee said she believed my mother wanted Marcus to be taken care of. The judge asked, "Did she ever say that to you directly?" The pause before Renee answered was 11 seconds long. I counted. "Not in those exact words," she said. That was the moment it was over. Judge Okafor set down her glasses, reviewed the evidence one more time, and ruled that the revised will was invalid. The prior will, the one drafted 11 years earlier and properly held on file, was reinstated. Under that will, the estate was to be divided equally between Marcus and me. Then she referred the matter to the Travis County District Attorney's Office for review of potential document fraud. Marcus did not look at me when we left the courtroom. He walked out ahead of his attorney with his jaw locked and his eyes on the ground. Renee looked at me only once on the courthouse steps. Half a second, maybe less. Then she looked away. I stood there in the October sun and thought about my mother driving 40 minutes back for a receipt. I thought about the recipe card I still keep in my kitchen drawer. Chicken and white beans. I make it every fall. I thought about that lowercase y. That tiny curling tail. A habit so deeply hers it survived illness, survived death, survived fraud, and walked into a courtroom as evidence. The estate took another 7 months to settle. The house was sold. The proceeds were divided. I eventually left Austin and took a position in Nashville. I've been here almost a year now. There are still parts of that time I have not fully unpacked. I don't know exactly how much Marcus knew or how much he chose not to know. And I've stopped trying to force that answer, because some questions are too expensive to keep living inside. But I know this. People like Renee count on exhaustion, on grief, on the way families close ranks around the person who sounds calmest. They count on you feeling too emotional to investigate, too guilty to press, too tired to document. So document anyway. Every date, every text, every voicemail, every signature. Keep the birthday cards, keep the letters, keep the recipe cards. Keep the ordinary things that prove who someone was when they were fully themselves. Because those things have weight. Those things can sit on a courtroom table and speak more clearly than the people who tried to rewrite a life after it ended. My mother was meticulous. She was careful. And in the end, that care outlasted all of them. They thought they could erase her with a forged signature. What they didn't understand was that my mother had spent her whole life leaving a trail of herself behind. And in the end, that trail led straight back to the truth.